My husband fell in love with the neighbor and said she made him feel like a real man, but he had no idea she was using him for something much worse. My husband started walking the neighbor's dog 3 months before I realized the neighbor didn't have a dog. That's the kind of detail that makes you question absolutely everything you thought you knew about your own life, your own marriage, your own supposed ability to read people and situations. The first time I saw them together, through the kitchen window on a Saturday morning, I felt a small pang of something I couldn't quite name. He was laughing at something she'd said, his head thrown back the way it used to be when we first started dating, before work and routine filed down the sharp edges of everything. She was walking beside him with a small brown terrier on a leash, gesturing animatedly, her accent making even simple words sound exotic and important. He looks happy, I thought. And then, when was the last time I made him laugh like that? I pushed the thought away and went back to my case files. I'm a divorce attorney, have been for almost a decade now, and I've spent countless thousands of hours sitting in my office listening to people describe in excruciating detail how their partners deceived them, how they missed signs that now seem glaringly obvious in retrospect, how they built entire lives on foundations that turned out to be nothing but quicksand waiting to swallow them whole. I always thought I was fundamentally different from those clients. I always thought my professional training, my carefully cultivated cynicism, my daily immersion in the absolute worst of human behavior had somehow inoculated me against that particular brand of dangerous blindness. Turns out I was just as vulnerable as everyone else who'd ever sat in my office clutching tissues and wondering how they could have been so stupid. Maybe even more vulnerable, because my confidence in my own judgment meant I never saw it coming, not even for a single moment. Her name was supposed to be something Eastern European, something that rolled off the tongue with soft consonants and long melodic vowels. She told us she was originally from Ukraine, a small town near Kiev, that she'd come to America about 3 years ago with a husband who seemed charming and romantic at first, but gradually turned controlling, then emotionally abusive, then physically violent in ways that left marks she had to explain away with increasingly creative excuses about clumsiness and accidents. The first time I really talked to her, she was standing in the hallway holding a bag of groceries and crying. My husband was at work. I was home early for once, nursing a headache after a particularly brutal deposition. I heard sounds through the door. I opened it and there she was. "I'm sorry," she said, wiping her eyes quickly. "I didn't mean to disturb you. Are you okay?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "My husband called. He found my new phone number somehow. I don't know how he does it. No matter how many times I change everything, he finds me." I invited her in for tea. It seemed like the decent thing to do. She sat at my kitchen table and told me about the man she'd married. Charming at first, then possessive, then dangerous. The escalation was gradual, she said. He controlled the money, the phone, her access to friends and family. By the time she realized what was happening, she was trapped. "Why didn't you go to the police?" I asked. "I tried. They said without physical evidence there was nothing they could do, and every time I tried to leave, he found me. He always finds me. I should have recognized the script. I'd heard versions of it hundreds of times in my office, from women whose husbands actually were abusive, but hearing it over tea in my own kitchen, watching the tears fall, seeing the fear in her eyes, it felt different. It felt real. "How did you end up here?" I asked. "I researched neighborhoods," she said, "safe buildings, good neighbors. When the apartment across the hall opened up, I knew it was a sign. You and your husband seem like such good people. I could tell just from watching you in the elevator." I didn't ask how long she'd been watching. She moved into the apartment directly across the hall from us in early spring, when the trees outside were just starting to bud. I remember thinking how striking she was when we first met in the elevator that Tuesday evening. Tall and angular with cheekbones that could cut glass, and an accent that made everything she said sound like poetry. My husband noticed her immediately. Of course he did. Everyone in the building noticed her. What I didn't realize at the time was that she had noticed us first. Long before she ever signed that lease, she'd been watching, studying, preparing her approach with the precision of a surgeon planning a complicated operation. The friendship started innocently enough, the way these devastating things always do when you're telling the story afterward, and trying to identify where exactly everything went wrong. She needed help carrying heavy boxes up the stairs because the elevator happened to be broken that particular weekend for maintenance. She didn't understand how the building's unnecessarily complicated laundry system worked and kept losing quarters in machines that ate her money without washing her clothes. She was confused about the recycling schedule and had gotten a formal warning from the building manager about putting the wrong materials in the wrong bins. My husband stepped in immediately to solve each of these small problems. He's always been that way. The kind of man who stops to help strangers change tires in the rain, who believes fundamentally in helping others even when it costs him something. It's one of the things I loved about him. It's also what made him the perfect target. I was working 60-hour weeks that spring, sometimes considerably more, desperately trying to make partner at the firm before I turned 40. I was handling 3 major divorces simultaneously, each one more emotionally complicated and legally contentious than the last, and I barely had time to eat a proper dinner most nights, let alone manage the mundane details of neighborly interaction. When my husband mentioned casually one morning that they'd started taking daily walks together while I slept in after yet another late night at the office, I thought it was sweet, healthy even. He needed more exercise, and I was clearly too busy and exhausted to be his workout partner. When she started cooking elaborate dinners for him on the many nights I worked late, I thought it was unexpectedly generous of her. She was new to the city, obviously lonely and isolated, grateful for the friendship we'd offered. When he gave her the code to our apartment's security system because she kept locking herself out of her own place and needed somewhere safe to wait for the building manager to arrive with spare keys, I thought it was entirely practical. She lived right across the hall. We saw her literally every day. What could possibly go wrong with such a small convenience? My mother was the first person to say something was wrong. She came to visit for a long weekend in May, and within 48 hours, she was pacing my kitchen with that look on her face, the one that's been warning me of trouble since I was a child. "Your husband talks about that woman constantly," she said, keeping her voice low. Every conversation circles back to her. "Mom, they're friends. She's going through a hard time." She turned to face me. He knows her coffee order. He knows her favorite color. He knows what time she goes to bed and what makes her cry. He knows more about her childhood than I know about yours. That's not fair, isn't it? She set down her coffee cup. When's the last time he talked about you that way to anyone? I didn't have an answer. "I'm not saying he's having an affair," she continued, "but something isn't right. A woman doesn't look at another woman's husband the way she looks at him unless she wants something. She's married. Her husband is abusive. She's scared of him. Have you met this husband? No, but have you seen any proof he exists? A photo? A police report? Anything at all?" I started to answer, then stopped. I hadn't. Everything I knew about him came from her stories, her tears, her carefully detailed accounts of abuse. "I've seen this before," my mother said quietly. "My friend. Do you remember her? She lost everything to a man who pretended to need help. He was patient. He was convincing. And by the time she realized what was happening, it was too late." "That's different." "Is it?" She left 2 days later. I was relieved to see her go, which should have told me something. I didn't want to think about what she'd said. I didn't want to examine why her questions made me so uncomfortable. 3 days after she flew home, my phone rang. It was from a private investigator. My mother had hired him without telling me, which normally would have infuriated me. But he wasn't calling to report an affair. He was calling about something stranger. "I've been watching her for a week," he said. "Something's off." "What do you mean?" "She enters your building at odd hours. 2, 3 in the morning sometimes. She meets with people in parking lots around the neighborhood. A man, a woman. Neither matches any description of the husband she's supposedly hiding from. And she's been studying your mailbox, your parking spot, your schedules, taking notes. This isn't casual interest. This is surveillance." "Maybe she's paranoid," I said. "Abuse victims can become hypervigilant. I've been doing this for 15 years. I know what paranoia looks like. This isn't paranoia. This is planning." I thanked him and hung up. Then I sat at my desk for a long time, staring at my office wall, trying to process what he'd told me. I told myself he was overreacting. His job was finding problems, so he found them everywhere. But something had shifted. A seed of doubt, and once it was there, I couldn't ignore it. Over the next few weeks, I started watching more carefully. I noticed how often his phone buzzed with messages from her, how he angled his screen away from me, how he talked about her problems like they were his responsibility. One evening, I came home early and heard them laughing in the hallway outside our door. The sound stopped when she saw me. Just for a second, something flickered across her face. Surprise, calculation, recovery. Then she smiled that warm smile and said she'd just been borrowing some olive oil. "She's such a good cook," my husband said as we went inside. "She's teaching me how to make authentic Ukrainian dishes." "That's nice," I said. And it was nice, in theory. But I kept thinking about that flicker on her face, that split second of something that wasn't warmth at all. The investigator called again a week later. She has a partner, he said. A man. They've been seen together multiple times at a hotel outside the city. Not romantically. They appear to be working on something. And there's a third person, a woman, who seems to be directing things from a distance. What kind of things? That's what I'm trying to figure out. But whatever it is, it's organized, professional. These aren't random meetings. I should have told my husband. I should have confronted the situation directly. Instead, I watched and waited, building a case the way I'd been trained to do, looking for evidence, waiting for the moment when I'd have enough to know for certain what I was dealing with. I should have known that by the time you have enough evidence, it's usually too late. The night everything finally and irreversibly fell apart started like any other Thursday in our ordinary lives. I'd had a brutal day in court, a custody battle that had gotten significantly uglier than anyone expected when the opposing husband's attorney introduced damaging evidence we hadn't anticipated and couldn't adequately counter. I came home about 2 hours earlier than I'd originally planned because I simply couldn't stand being in the office anymore. Couldn't stand looking at those files for another minute while replaying every mistake I'd made. I remember the exact moment I opened the front door. The apartment smelled like garlic and wine, rich and warm and welcoming. Candles were lit on the dining table, the good expensive ones we saved for special occasions and anniversaries. For a split second, I thought maybe my husband had planned something romantic. A surprise dinner, an attempt to reconnect after months of me being absent. Then I saw them. My husband and the neighbor were sitting across from each other, plates of homemade pasta between them like some kind of romantic dinner for two. She was crying, showing him a bruise on her upper arm that she said her husband had given her just the night before. According to her detailed story, told between theatrical sobs that now seem so obviously performed in retrospect, he'd somehow found her despite all her precautions, cornered her alone in a parking garage near where she supposedly worked part-time, grabbed her roughly, twisted her arm behind her back, told her in threatening whispers she'd never escape him no matter how far she ran or how many people tried to protect her from him. My husband was holding her hand tenderly across the table, looking at her with this fierce protective intensity that I hadn't seen directed at me in years, maybe ever, if I'm being completely honest with myself. And something cold and heavy settled in my chest, watching them together like that. Something that felt less like jealousy and more like sudden, terrible, unwelcome clarity about what had been happening in my own home for months. I walked over to the table and sat down beside them. She looked up at me with those practiced tears streaming down her face. "Tell me again what happened." "What?" I said, "from the beginning." She launched into the story, her voice trembling. "He found me in the parking garage. He grabbed me, twisted my arm behind my back. He said I'd never get away from him." "When did this happen?" I asked. "Last night, around 8. But you told my husband 2 days ago that you'd been home all day with a migraine." She blinked. "That was different. That was before. And your husband, he's left-handed, right? You mentioned that. But this bruise, the grip pattern, it's from a right hand." The tears stopped. Just for a second, but I noticed. Something flickered behind her eyes, a calculation happening in real time. I pulled out my phone and showed her the screen. His Instagram. Geotagged photos from a conference in Berlin, posted yesterday. How exactly did he corner you in a parking garage when he's been in Germany all week? The neighbor's carefully constructed face changed when she realized I was catching on to the inconsistencies in her story. It was subtle, just the briefest flicker behind her eyes. But I'd spent years reading people in courtrooms and depositions, and I knew exactly what I was seeing. The mask was slipping. Whatever elaborate performance she'd been giving for the past 4 months, she was starting to lose control of her carefully constructed narrative. My husband, bless his oblivious and well-meaning heart, didn't notice anything wrong at all. He was still holding her hand comfortingly, still gazing at her with that intoxicating mixture of concern and something darker, still completely invested in the story she'd been selling him like it was gospel truth delivered from on high. My phone buzzed insistently in my pocket. A text from the investigator my mother had hired. "Someone just entered your apartment building using your personal security code." Male, unfamiliar, went directly to the 4th floor without hesitation. I felt something cold run down my spine like ice water, settling into my stomach with a weight that made it hard to breathe normally. The 4th floor was where my home office was located. The office where I kept case files, client information, confidential documents that could destroy people's lives and marriages and financial futures if they fell into the wrong hands. Information that unscrupulous people would pay enormous amounts of money to access for various illegal purposes. I excused myself from the table as calmly as I could manage, said I needed to use the bathroom, and instead walked quietly down the hallway toward my office door. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it clearly in my ears like a drum. Part of me honestly expected to find nothing at all, to discover that the investigator had been wrong or paranoid or simply watching the wrong building entrance. But the door to my office was standing open, just slightly ajar. When I knew with absolute certainty I'd closed and locked it that very morning, a man I'd never seen before in my entire life was standing at my desk in the dim light, a professional-looking camera in his hands, methodically photographing the documents I'd carelessly left out that afternoon: case files, financial records, settlement negotiations, information that my clients had entrusted to me with the reasonable expectation of complete professional confidentiality. For a moment, I just stood there, frozen in the doorway, my brain stubbornly refusing to process what my eyes were clearly and unmistakably seeing. Then I screamed. Not a strategic scream, not a calculated reaction designed to achieve a specific outcome, just a raw, primal sound of violation and fury that brought my husband running from the dining room within seconds. The next several hours were chaos. The police came quickly. The man with the camera was arrested, still holding evidence of what he'd been doing. The neighbor tried to run for the stairs and was stopped by officers in the hallway. I watched them put her in handcuffs. She looked at me as they led her past, and for just a second, the mask dropped completely. There was no fear in her eyes, no regret, just cold calculation, like a chess player who'd lost a game and was already planning the next one. "You would have figured it out eventually," she said. "They always do." At the police station, the detective let me watch through the one-way glass as they questioned her. I needed to see it. I needed to understand. The accent disappeared first. One moment she was the frightened Ukrainian immigrant. The next, she was speaking in flat, unaccented English. "How long have you been running this operation?" the detective asked. "I want a lawyer," she said. But she was smiling. The truth came out in pieces over the following weeks. There was no abusive husband. Never had been. The accent was fake, perfected over years of practice. She wasn't from Ukraine, wasn't an immigrant, wasn't a victim of anything except her own choices. She was part of a professional crew that targeted people with access to valuable information. Her partner, the man with the camera, was her actual husband. The coordinator who'd fled before police arrived was the mastermind who'd selected targets and handled the sale of stolen data. They didn't want my husband. They didn't want my money. They didn't even want me. What they wanted was sitting in filing cabinets in my home office. Information about wealthy people going through bitter divorces. Hidden assets, offshore accounts, shell companies, settlement strategies, the kind of information that's worth a fortune to the right buyer, an angry spouse trying to gain leverage, a competitor looking for weaknesses, identity thieves, blackmailers. My clients had trusted me with their most dangerous secrets, and I'd been keeping those secrets in an apartment where a stranger had the security code. They'd been watching me for months before she ever moved in. They knew my schedule, my cases, my weaknesses. They knew my husband was lonely, that I worked too much, that he needed to feel heroic in ways our stable marriage didn't provide. Every detail of their friendship had been manufactured. The vulnerability, the intimacy, the trust, all of it designed to get access to my files. The bruises were makeup. The tears were acting. The dog my husband walked every morning belonged to someone else, borrowed to create opportunities for contact. What made it worse was that my husband hadn't technically cheated. He hadn't slept with her or kissed her, but he'd given her everything else: his time, his attention, his emotional energy, his trust. He'd shared things with her that he hadn't shared with me in years. And when I tried to explain why that hurt almost as much as physical betrayal, he looked at me with genuine confusion, like he truly didn't understand what he'd done wrong. The professional fallout was immediate and devastating. I had to report the breach to my firm the next morning, sitting in the senior partner's corner office explaining that client information had been compromised because a con artist manipulated my husband into giving away our security code. The meeting lasted 2 hours. Every question felt like an accusation. "How long did you know this woman?" 4 months. "And you never suspected anything?" I had concerns. I was investigating. Investigating. He wrote something on his notepad, rather than, say, changing your security code or alerting us to a potential threat. I didn't know what the threat was. I thought it might be personal. Instead, it was professional. And now our clients are exposed. There was nothing I could say to that. He was right. The forensic team spent 3 days in my home office, cataloging which files had been exposed. They photographed everything. asked questions about my filing system, my security protocols, why I kept certain documents at home instead of in the firm's secure storage. I'd never thought about it before. Everyone took work home. That's what you did when you were trying to make partner. But I'd also never been targeted by professional criminals before. The worst part was calling my clients. The partners offered to handle it through official channels, but I insisted on doing it myself. I owed them that much. The first call was to a woman whose husband had hidden millions overseas. We'd spent months building that case, documenting every offshore account, every shell company, every fraudulent transfer. If that information got out, her entire divorce strategy would collapse. I trusted you, she said when I finished explaining. I told you things I've never told anyone. My children's social security numbers, my hidden accounts, everything. I know. I'm so sorry. Sorry doesn't help me if my husband's lawyers know what we know. No, it doesn't. She fired me that afternoon. I didn't blame her. The second call went to a business owner in the middle of contentious custody negotiations. His ex-wife had accused him of financial fraud. We'd been building a defense based on documents that were now potentially compromised. How did this happen? He demanded. You're supposed to protect this information. That's your job. I know. I trusted you with my life, my kids' lives, and some con artist got into your files because your husband gave away your security code? Yes. Long silence. Then, I should sue you for negligence. He didn't, ultimately. But he transferred his case to another attorney and reported me to the state bar. The ethics complaint was eventually dismissed, but not before 6 months of anxiety and 3 separate interviews with investigators. The third client was more understanding. He was an older man, a retired executive whose wife had walked out after 40 years of marriage. He'd seen enough of life to know that bad things happen to good people. I'm not going to pretend this doesn't concern me, he said when I told him. But I've read about these operations. They target smart people, careful people. The shame isn't in being fooled. It's in how you handle it afterward. Thank you. I'll transfer my case to another attorney here. No offense intended. None taken. He paused. For what it's worth, I think you'll come back from this. I've watched you work. You're good at what you do. One mistake doesn't erase that. It was the kindest thing anyone said to me during those first terrible weeks. I held on to it during the long nights when I couldn't sleep, when I lay awake cataloging every mistake I'd made, every sign I should have seen. My path to partnership was suspended indefinitely. I was removed from sensitive cases, relegated to routine matters. Colleagues who'd smiled at me now avoided eye contact. I heard whispers, fragments of conversations that stopped when I approached. The rumor mill worked overtime. Was I careless or complicit? Had I known about my husband's relationship? Was the whole thing some kind of insurance fraud? The theories got more elaborate the longer the investigation dragged on. I couldn't even blame them. The irony wasn't lost on me. A divorce attorney who couldn't see the manipulation in her own home. Every night I lay awake replaying those 4 months, searching for the moment I should have seen through it all. The signs were everywhere once I knew what to look for. The investigation expanded over the following weeks as law enforcement dug deeper. Our neighbor and her partners weren't amateurs. They'd been running variations of this scheme for years, moving from city to city, targeting professionals with access to valuable confidential information. A doctor in another state had lost his medical license after they stole patient records that were later sold to identity thieves. A financial advisor watched his firm collapse when client portfolio information leaked to competitors. A corporate attorney nearly went to prison for what prosecutors initially thought was insider trading, before investigators realized he'd been victimized by the same crew. The woman who'd posed as my neighbor had been doing this for more than 4 years. She could read people instantly, identify vulnerabilities, become whatever they needed. For my husband, that meant being helpless and grateful, someone who made him feel strong and heroic. For other victims, she'd played different roles: a struggling single mother, a grieving widow, a frightened immigrant. Whatever persona got her through the door. The coordinator, who'd selected targets and sold the stolen information, escaped before police arrived that night. International warrants were issued, agencies coordinated across borders, but she was smart and careful. The investigators told me she was probably already setting up the next phase of her operation somewhere else. The chances of catching her seemed frustratingly slim. Then, 6 months later, they got her. She was trying to cross a border with forged documents, probably heading to set up shop somewhere new. The arrest felt like victory for about 12 hours until I realized it meant more proceedings, more testimony, more opportunities to relive everything in painful detail. Meanwhile, my husband had moved into the guest room. We weren't fighting. Fighting would have required energy I didn't have. We existed in careful silence, two people in the same space trying not to connect. He wanted to apologize, to explain how completely he'd been deceived, and I knew he had been, systematically, by professionals who'd studied his weaknesses and exploited them over months. But knowing that didn't make it hurt less. One morning, about a week after the arrests, I found him in the kitchen making coffee. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "I keep going over it," he said without preamble. "Every conversation, every interaction, looking for the moment I should have seen through it." "Me too." He turned to face me. She was so convincing. The fear in her eyes when she talked about her husband. The gratitude when I helped her with something small. I thought I was doing something good. Being the kind of person you'd want me to be. That hit harder than he probably intended. "Is that why you did it?" I asked. "To be the person I wanted?" "Partly." He sat down at the table. "But also, she saw me. Actually saw me. Not as your husband, not as somebody's spouse, just as me. She asked about my day, my thoughts, my dreams. She remembered things I'd told her weeks before. Do you know how long it's been since you asked me about any of that?" I wanted to argue. I wanted to say I'd been working 12-hour days trying to build a future for both of us. But he wasn't wrong, and we both knew it. "That doesn't excuse what I did," he said. "I should have told you what was happening. I should have asked before giving her the code. I should have, I don't know, been better. Why didn't you tell me? Because I knew you'd see it for what it was. An emotional affair. Even if nothing physical happened, even if I never touched her, I was falling in love with someone else, with the person she was pretending to be. And I was too ashamed to admit it, even to myself." The words hung in the air between us. I waited to feel something. Rage, betrayal, grief. Instead, there was just a dull ache and a kind of exhausted recognition. "What happens now?" he asked. "I don't know. I honestly don't know. I want to fix this. I want to earn back your trust. I know you do. But I don't know if that's possible." 3 weeks later, he came to my home office and sat in the chair across from my desk, the chair where clients usually sat. "I need to understand something," he said. "Did you know? Before that night? Were you testing me?" I could have lied, but we were past easy lies. "Yes. My mother hired an investigator. I knew something was wrong. I just didn't know what. So you watched me. Watched and waited to see what I'd do. I watched. I didn't know how to ask. I didn't know if I wanted the answer." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said something unexpected. Maybe we were both testing each other. "Maybe we have been for years. You pulled away into your work. I found someone who made me feel needed. Neither of us said anything. We just watched each other fail. I wanted to argue, defend myself, explain the pressure I'd been under. But sitting there surrounded by the case files that had defined my life more than my marriage had, I couldn't." He wasn't entirely wrong. The conversation didn't fix anything between us. It wasn't meant to fix anything, not really. But it was honest in a way our communication hadn't been for longer than I wanted to acknowledge. And that honesty counted for something important. We agreed to try couples therapy together, to see if there was anything worth salvaging underneath all the accumulated damage and resentment. But even as we made concrete plans to work on our relationship, I could feel the distance between us solidifying into something permanent, like wet cement setting into its final shape. Some breaches simply can't be repaired with good intentions. Some betrayals, even the ones that don't technically qualify as betrayals, leave marks too deep to ever fully heal. Life has a persistent way of moving forward, even when you feel completely frozen in place. The legal proceedings against the neighbor and her partner dragged on through the entire summer and well into fall. A slow grind of preliminary hearings and legal motions and plea negotiations that felt absolutely exhausting even from my position on the periphery. I wasn't a witness to anything particularly critical, just another victim among many, which meant I mostly watched from the sidelines while federal prosecutors methodically built their case against the operation. The coordinator, the woman who'd orchestrated the entire scheme from behind the scenes, was eventually captured trying to cross an international border with an obviously forged passport. That felt like genuine victory for approximately 12 hours, until I realized that her arrest just meant additional proceedings. More testimony requirements, more opportunities to relive the worst months of my entire life in painful public detail. The justice system moves slowly when it moves at all. The firm let me keep my job, which I suppose I should have been grateful for given the circumstances. But the partnership track remained firmly closed to me for the foreseeable future. My supervisor, a man I genuinely respected for most of my career, sat me down in his corner office and explained the situation using careful corporate language designed to sound reasonable while delivering devastating news. The incident had raised serious questions about professional judgment, he said. Not my integrity, he was quick to clarify, just my judgment in certain situations. The partners collectively felt that more time was needed to rebuild institutional confidence in my capabilities. Maybe in another year or two, once things had fully settled, we could revisit the partnership conversation. I nodded and thanked him for his candor and walked back to my smaller office, feeling like I'd just been handed a life sentence disguised as a generous second chance. My mother, to her credit, never said I told you so. She'd earned the right. She'd paid for that investigator out of her own retirement savings because she trusted her instincts when I wouldn't. She started visiting more often. Every other weekend at first, then every weekend. She'd bring food I didn't ask for, sit with me on long afternoons when the silence felt unbearable. About a month after the arrests, she told me about her friend, the one she'd mentioned before. I didn't tell you the whole story, she said. We were sitting in my kitchen, drinking tea that had gone cold while we talked about what happened to her. I thought it was a financial advisor who stole her money. It was. But that wasn't all. She paused, looking down at her hands. She trusted him completely. He spent 2 years building that trust, came to holiday dinners, met her grandchildren, and the whole time he was systematically draining her accounts. By the time she realized what was happening, she'd lost everything. Her savings, her house, her dignity. She never recovered from the shame. What happened to her? She died 3 years later. Heart attack, they said. But I always thought it was really a broken heart. She couldn't forgive herself for being fooled. My mother looked up at me then, and I saw something in her eyes I'd never seen before. Fear. That's why I hired the investigator, she said. That's why I pushed so hard. I've seen what these people can do. How they destroy not just finances, but souls. I wasn't going to watch it happen to you. I didn't know. Of course you didn't. I never told you. I thought if I didn't talk about it, the danger would stay away from my family. She laughed bitterly. As if that's how the world works. I'm sorry I didn't listen to you. No. She reached across the table and took my hand. I'm sorry I was right. We sat there for a long time, holding hands, saying nothing. For the first time since everything happened, I didn't feel completely alone. The therapy sessions with my husband were strange exercises in emotional archaeology. Our therapist was skilled, asking questions that forced us to actually look at each other. There was one session, about 2 months in, that I still think about. The therapist asked us to describe a moment when we'd felt truly connected. Our honeymoon, my husband said immediately, watching the sunset on that beach, feeling like we had all the time in the world. And you? The therapist asked me. I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. I kept trying to summon a memory from the last 5 years, something that would prove we'd maintained that connection. I came up empty. The early years, I finally said, before the firm became everything. The therapist didn't comment. She didn't have to. We all understood what that silence meant. My husband kept saying he wanted to earn back my trust, but every time I looked at him, I saw him reaching across that candlelit table, taking her hand. Some images burn themselves into your memory so deeply they become the only thing you can see. The main federal trial happened 8 months after the arrests. I testified for several hours about the impact on my life, answering questions while the woman who'd pretended to be my neighbor watched from the defense table. The prosecutor walked me through everything. The timeline of deception, how she'd gained access to my life and files, the damage to my career and marriage. I kept my voice steady through most of it, even describing the moment I found the man in my office, even recounting the phone call where I told my most valued client her information might be compromised. What I wasn't prepared for was cross-examination. Ms. Attorney, the defense lawyer began, isn't it true that you allowed your husband to distribute your security code without your knowledge or consent? I didn't allow anything. He made a decision without consulting me, a decision you didn't notice for months, despite living in the same home. I worked long hours. I trusted my husband. You trusted him. He paused for effect. But you also hired a private investigator to follow him, didn't you? My mother hired the investigator, after expressing concerns to you. Concerns you dismissed. Isn't that correct? I wanted to scream that none of this would have happened if his client hadn't systematically lied her way into our lives. But I'd been in enough courtrooms to know losing composure would only hurt my credibility. I trusted a woman who turned out to be a professional con artist, I said. As did my husband. As did everyone she targeted before us. She looked different in court. No makeup, hair pulled back, plain clothes chosen by her attorneys to generate sympathy. She didn't look like a predator. She looked like someone who'd made mistakes, someone deserving of mercy. I had to keep reminding myself forcefully that the scared, vulnerable woman I'd thought I knew had never actually existed. This person sitting in front of me was a complete stranger. She'd always been a complete stranger wearing an elaborate costume. The defense attorneys tried predictably to paint me as partially responsible for what happened, as carelessly negligent with my confidential documents, as someone who'd essentially invited trouble through professional incompetence. I expected the strategy. I'd been in enough courtrooms over my career to know exactly how these things typically worked. But hearing those accusations said out loud in a public forum, having my professional competence questioned aggressively by lawyers who knew absolutely nothing about my work or my life or my actual level of care, was significantly harder than I'd anticipated. I kept my composure on the witness stand because that's what you do. But afterward, I sat alone in my car in the courthouse parking garage and cried harder than I had since everything began. Something about the public nature of it, the official record being created, the transcript that would exist forever, made everything feel more permanent, more real. A woman found me there, crying in my car. She knocked on the window gently. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said when I rolled down the window. "I was in the courtroom. I heard your testimony." I wiped my eyes. "I'm fine. Just processing." She nodded slowly. "I was a victim too. Different city, different scheme, but the same crew. They took everything from me. My savings, my reputation, my marriage. I'm sorry. The thing is," she said, "I blamed myself for years. I thought I should have seen it, should have been smarter. But watching the trial today, hearing how they operated, they're professionals. This is what they do. We didn't stand a chance." That doesn't make it easier. No, but it helps to know you're not alone, that it wasn't your fault. She gave me her card before she left. A support group for fraud victims. I wasn't sure I'd ever use it, but I put it in my wallet anyway. Sometimes knowing you're not alone is enough. Both defendants were eventually convicted on multiple federal charges. The sentencing hearing was almost harder than the trial itself. The prosecutor read victim impact statements from people across 5 states. The doctor who lost his license. The financial advisor whose firm collapsed. A woman whose identity had been stolen 3 times using information this crew had sold. Each story was a variation of mine. Someone who'd tried to help, someone who'd been manipulated, someone whose trust had been weaponized against them. When it was my turn to speak, I'd prepared remarks, pages of carefully crafted sentences about professional damage and personal betrayal. But standing there, looking at the woman who'd eaten at my table and cried on my husband's shoulder, I abandoned the script. "I'm a divorce attorney," I said. "I spend my days listening to people explain how they were deceived by someone they trusted. I always thought I understood. I didn't. You can't understand until it happens to you." The judge asked if I wanted to address the defendant directly. I looked at her. She looked back, expressionless. "I hope you think about it," I said. "Every day. I hope you think about the doctor who can't practice medicine anymore, the families you tore apart, the careers you destroyed. I hope it keeps you up at night the way it keeps me up." She didn't react. I don't think she was capable of it. The coordinator got 12 years. The woman who'd been my neighbor got 8. The sentences felt both too long and not long enough. Justice always does. After the hearing, the prosecutor approached me in the hallway. "For what it's worth," she said. "You handled yourself well in there." I didn't feel like I'd handled anything well. I felt like I'd survived something I shouldn't have had to face in the first place. I wanted the verdicts to feel like justice. Mostly they just felt like endings. What happened between me and my husband ended more quietly than the criminal case. Without courtroom drama or public testimony. We kept trying for 6 months after the trial. Therapy sessions, difficult conversations, attempts to rebuild something from the wreckage. But some things can't be rebuilt. Some damage goes too deep. The moment I knew it was over came on an ordinary Tuesday evening. He was cooking dinner, something he'd started doing more often, as if domestic gestures could repair what had broken. I walked into the kitchen and saw him standing at the stove, stirring something in a pot, and I felt nothing. No anger, no love, no grief, just emptiness. That's when I knew. "I want a divorce," I said the following Sunday, over coffee that had gone cold while we talked around the obvious subject. He didn't look surprised, disappointed, sad, but not surprised. Maybe he'd been waiting for me to say it. Maybe he'd wanted to say it himself but couldn't find the courage. "Is there anything I can do?" he asked. "No, I don't think there is." We sat there for a long time, not touching, not speaking. 2 people who'd shared a life for years, now strangers sitting across a kitchen table. The divorce itself was straightforward. We both wanted it over. No children to fight over, no complicated assets to divide. Just two people who'd stopped recognizing each other, deciding to stop pretending. He kept asking if there was something he could do differently, some gesture that might bring me back. But it wasn't about gestures. I'd forgiven him for being manipulated. What I couldn't forgive was the vulnerability that made it possible, and my own role in creating it. The mediation was brief and businesslike. We divided possessions without argument. He took the bedroom furniture. I took the kitchen things. We split the books alphabetically. It felt strange, dismantling a decade of shared life in a few hours of efficient negotiation. But maybe that's how it should be. Quick, clean, like pulling off a bandage. We sold the apartment because neither of us could stand living there anymore. The real estate agent suggested staging it to look warm and inviting, but every time I walked through those rooms, I felt sick. The kitchen where she'd cook dinners for him while I worked late. I could still see them sitting there, plates of pasta between them, her hand reaching across the table. The living room where they'd watched movies on nights I came home too exhausted to do anything but sleep. He'd told me about their movie nights casually, like it was the most normal thing in the world. She likes old romantic comedies, he'd said. Isn't that sweet? The hallway outside my office where I'd found her once, supposedly looking for the bathroom. She'd been standing very still, looking at my closed office door. Just got turned around, she'd said with that practiced smile. All these doors look the same. She'd been counting steps, mapping the layout, figuring out which door led to the information her crew needed. On the day we signed the sale papers, I walked through the empty apartment one last time. The rooms looked smaller without furniture, more ordinary. It was hard to believe so much damage had happened in such an unremarkable space. I found a much smaller place in a different neighborhood, somewhere with no history, no ghosts, no contaminated memories waiting around every corner. Starting over at my age wasn't what I'd planned, but nothing about the past 2 years had been what I'd planned. Sometimes life hands you a completely different story than the one you thought you were writing. 2 years have passed since that Thursday night. 2 years of rebuilding, of therapy, of slowly remembering who I am outside of a marriage that stopped working long before it ended. The first year was the hardest. I'd come home to my small apartment after work and sit in the silence, wondering what to do with myself. For years, every free moment had been about the firm. Late nights, weekend work, the endless pursuit of partnership. Now partnership was on hold indefinitely, and I had evenings free for the first time in a decade. I didn't know what to do with them. I started cooking. Simple things at first, meals for one. Then more complicated dishes, the kind that took hours and required concentration. It was something to focus on besides the wreckage of my life. I started therapy. Real therapy, not the couple's work I'd done with my husband, but sessions just for me. We talked about why I'd chosen observation over confrontation, why I'd built my identity around work to the point where my marriage became background noise, why I'd needed to watch my husband fail instead of simply asking him what was happening. You were afraid, my therapist said one day, afraid that if you asked, you'd get an answer you couldn't live with. I wasn't afraid of him cheating, I said. I was afraid he'd tell me he was unhappy, that the marriage was broken, that I'd been failing at something I hadn't even noticed I was supposed to be maintaining. And now I know I was failing. We both were. But at least now I know. The firm eventually let me back onto the partnership track. The meeting with the senior partners was uncomfortable. They listed conditions, required check-ins, a probationary period that felt humiliating. But I took it. I'd worked too hard to walk away. Slowly, case by case, I rebuilt my reputation. New clients didn't know my history. Old colleagues eventually stopped whispering when I passed. The work was the same, but I was different. More careful, more present, less convinced I had all the answers. My mother and I have lunch every Sunday now. She doesn't mention what happened anymore, doesn't need to say I told you so. We talk about normal things, her garden, my cases, a book club she joined. Sometimes she looks at me with this expression, pride mixed with relief. And I know she's thinking about how close she came to losing me to something she saw coming when I couldn't. I started dating again about 6 months ago. The first few attempts were disasters. I analyzed every word, looked for hidden meanings, watched for signs of deception. I couldn't turn off the vigilance. My therapist laughed when I told her. Some caution is healthy, she said, but not everyone is running a con. Most people are just people, flawed, complicated, trying their best. How do you tell the difference? You can't always. That's the risk of trusting anyone. But the alternative is being alone forever, and I don't think that's what you want. She was right. It wasn't. There's someone now. Early days still, nothing serious. He's a teacher, divorced, 2 kids he sees on weekends. We met at a friend's dinner party. He made me laugh about something stupid. And I realized I hadn't laughed like that in years. I told him the story on our 3rd date. All of it. The neighbor, the con, the divorce. I watched his face as I talked, looking for judgment or pity or the kind of skepticism that would tell me to run. "That's insane," he said when I finished. "I can't imagine going through something like that." "You don't think I was stupid? Naive? I think you were human. Someone exploited that. That's on them, not you." It was the right answer. Maybe too right. I found myself wondering if he'd practiced it, if he was performing understanding to get something from me. The paranoia doesn't go away completely, but I'm learning to notice it without letting it control me. Last month, I ran into my ex-husband outside a coffee shop near the courthouse. He was with someone new, laughing at something she'd said. He looked happy in a way I hadn't seen in years. We talked briefly. The stilted conversation you have with someone you used to share a life with. "You look good," he said. "So do you." He introduced me to his girlfriend. She seemed nice. Warm smile, firm handshake. Nothing about her reminded me of the neighbor, which I suppose was the point. "I'm glad you're doing well," he said as we were about to part. "Really, I know things ended badly between us, but I never wanted anything but good things for you." "I know. Same for you." There was a moment, standing there on the sidewalk, where I could have said something more, could have tried to articulate all the complicated feelings that still surfaced sometimes when I thought about us. But what was the point? The anger had burned out somewhere along the way, leaving something that felt less like forgiveness and more like indifference. He was a chapter that had ended. Other chapters were beginning. I wished him well and meant it. Then I walked away, toward my car, toward my new apartment, toward whatever came next. The woman who called herself my neighbor will remain in federal prison for several more years. Sometimes I wonder what she thinks about, lying in her cell at night, whether she remembers the people she hurt, the lives she dismantled, whether she feels anything at all. I try not to think about her often. When I do, I try to focus on the clinical aspects. How the con worked, why I fell for it, what I would do differently now. It's easier than thinking about the emotional devastation, easier than remembering how completely I trusted someone who never existed. Being deceived by a professional doesn't make you stupid. It makes you human. That's what my therapist says anyway. Most days I believe her. My definition of trust has evolved. I used to think trust meant complete openness. No barriers, no protection, no verification. Just faith that the other person wouldn't hurt you. Now I understand that trust can coexist with caution. You can love someone while still paying attention to warning signs. You can be vulnerable while still protecting yourself. Skepticism isn't the enemy of intimacy. Sometimes it's what makes intimacy possible. It's a more complicated philosophy, less romantic, but more honest about how the world actually works. Sometimes late at night, when sleep won't come and my small apartment feels too quiet, I think about what ifs. What if my mother hadn't hired that investigator? What if I'd come home an hour later that Thursday night? What if the scheme had succeeded completely? If my client's information had been stolen and sold? If my career had ended not in setback but in ruins? The questions are endless and pointless. You can't live in what ifs. You can only live in what happened and what you do with it afterward. The apartment I live in now has one neighbor, an elderly man named who waves politely when we pass in the hallway and otherwise keeps to himself. I like it that way. The simplicity, the quiet, the space to figure out who I'm becoming, now that I'm not defined by a marriage or a betrayal or someone else's crimes. I'm still dating the teacher. We had dinner last week at a restaurant near the water, a small Italian place with candles on the tables and a view of the harbor. Afterward, we walked along the shore in the dark, talking about nothing important. His students, a movie he wanted to see, a trip he was planning for summer break. He reached for my hand and I let him take it. "You're smiling," he said. "I am?" "You are." "What are you thinking about?" "Nothing. Everything. Just how strange it is to be happy again. How I forgot this was possible." He stopped walking and turned to face me. The moonlight caught his face, made him look younger somehow. Strange how? Strange like being with someone and not waiting for the other shoe to drop. Trusting that the person in front of me is actually who they say they are. Not spending every conversation looking for lies. "And do you? Trust me?" "I'm trying to. That's the best I can offer right now." He nodded slowly, not offended, just considering. "I can work with that." We kept walking along the shore, his hand warm in mine. The water lapped against the sand. Somewhere in the distance, a boat horn sounded, low and mournful. I don't know if this relationship will last. I don't know if I'm capable of the kind of trust it takes to build a life with someone again. The walls I've built aren't coming down easily, and maybe they shouldn't. Maybe some caution is just common sense disguised as damage. But I'm willing to find out. That feels like progress. On good days, and most days are good now, I can see everything that happened as an unexpected teacher. The con artist gave me proof I could survive worse than I'd imagined possible. She gave me the push to end a marriage that wasn't working. She gave me clarity about what actually matters. Not partnership, not status, not the relentless accumulation of professional achievements, but the simple daily work of being present with the people who love you. Strange gifts, wrapped in damage and deception. But I'll take them. My name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is what I learned through living it. Trust carefully. Not because everyone is a con artist, most people aren't, but because the ones who are have made deception their profession. They're better at lying than you are at detecting lies. That's just mathematics. Pay attention to warning signs, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable. The things we don't want to see are usually the things we most need to notice. Listen to the people who love you when they tell you something's wrong. They're not always right, but they're seeing you from an angle you can't see yourself. That perspective matters. And when life hands you a con artist dressed as a damsel in distress, don't be too proud to admit you were fooled. We're all capable of being fooled by the right person with the right approach, saying the right things at the right time. The only real question is what we choose to do with that humbling knowledge afterward.